This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Melissa Reuter, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal, and to Timothy Alcock, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Timothy writes, "Having listened now for a number of years, I feel honor-bound to pay back for all your hard work. I really love the episodes that are panel-based, as well as those looking at culture, politics, and the media. So big thanks again to Melissa Reuter and Timothy Alcock, and to everyone else who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 418 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new Hulu series Devs, created by Alex Garland, director of Ex Machina and Annihilation. And this will involve spoilers for the entire show, so just be aware of that. And if you missed it, you should definitely check out our interview with Alex Garland back in episode 147. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Anthony Ha, making his 19th appearance on the show. He covers media, advertising, and pop culture for the news site TechCrunch, where he also hosts the podcast Original Content. A chapbook of his short stories called Love Songs for Monsters was published by Youth in Decline in 2014, and his short story Late Train appeared in the February 2019 issue of Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. So Anthony, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm excited to be back.
The next up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, making her 18th appearance on the show. She's a Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in Connecticut with a Renaissance engineer, a dog, and a bird. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
And also joining us today is Raphael Jordan, making his 11th appearance on the show. He's written over 25 feature films that have premiered on video and cable television, including The Immortal Voyage of Captain Drake, Star Runners, and Vampire Nation. He also co-wrote the new series Salvage Marines, starring Casper Van Dien and Peter Shinkota. So Raphael, welcome to the show.
Always love to be here.
All right, so let's start off with Anthony and have you tell us what were your expectations going into Devs?
They were very high. I didn't know much about the concept or the show itself, but I am a big fan of Alex Garland. Even before he started directing his own films, 28 Days Later and especially Sunshine are probably 2 of my favorite films of the last few decades. I also really liked Ex Machina. I really liked Annihilation. I also got to interview him when Ex Machina came out, and he was just such a, smart but also very unpretentious, surprisingly unpretentious and nice guy. And so I think all of those things together, I had really high expectations for the show, even though I knew almost nothing about it going into it.
It's funny, I mentioned in the intro there that I interviewed Alex Garland, and that was one of the few that I did in person. I think I've only done 2 maybe in person. But so it was in, I think, like the basement of the Four Seasons or something, and he comes in, and I had all these questions. So I asked him, I do want to talk about Ex Machina, which was his new film at the time, but I said, I have a lot of other questions I want to ask you. Is that okay? About science fiction and stuff. He's just kind of like slouching there. He's like, yeah, man, whatever. Like anything's fine with me. He's like so relaxed. But yeah, I thought, because I heard you say that Sunshine's one of your favorite movies. I guess I'll say, Annihilation is, I think, my favorite movie of the last decade. And I haven't seen Sunshine. It's interesting. Everyone I've talked to about it, everyone says that for the first half, it's a great science fiction movie. And then for the second half, it's a bad horror movie. And so I never got around to watching it for that reason.
I think there's some validity to that. And in fact, one of the funny things about our interview was at one point he mentioned Sunshine and he seemed more down on it than I did, probably for some of those reasons that you're alluding to. But I mean, I'm also somebody who just is more comfortable, I think, with uneven movies than a lot of people. I'm like really, I can still really enjoy a movie if I think it falls apart at the end or starts off weak or what have you. And so to me, I think I'm more able to compartmentalize it. And I don't think the horror movie that it becomes, I don't think it's half, it's more like maybe a third. And I don't think it's that bad. It's just not as good as what came before it. And what's there is so good that I'm willing to forgive the admittedly pretty formulaic horror stuff.
I mean, it's interesting. I'd actually forgotten how many things that I liked that he was involved with. He wrote Dread, which is surprisingly good. He wrote, actually I read his novel The Beach years ago when I was in Ireland. So yeah, I mean, I was sort of, as I was doing research for this, I was just remembering like, oh yeah, he was involved with all these different things that were great. And so, I mean, I really think of him as, him and Denis Villeneuve are sort of like the standard bearers for intelligent science fiction films that reach a large audience right now, seems to me.
I feel the same way, although I think Villeneuve is somebody who I admire without necessarily having loved any of his films. I feel like I watch the movies and I'm like, that was well made and smart, and I'm glad I saw it. But whereas like Sunshine in particular, but really all of his films, even Dread, I feel like are movies that just kind of hit me a little bit harder than any of Villeneuve's films. You
didn't love Arrival?
I think partly because I, had read the Ted Chiang story, and it felt like so many of the things I liked came from the Ted Chiang story. So as a film, I thought it was pretty good, but like the sort of Hollywood stuff that was overlaid on top of it, particularly at the end, I didn't like as much. Again, I liked it. It just didn't kind of, it wasn't like a movie that I sort of thought about a lot.
No judgments. We're in the circle of trust.
Okay.
Okay. How about Sarah? What were your expectations going into Devs?
Well, I thankfully had not heard of it. It was a recommendation from my partner's brother-in-law, and I, as soon as I Googled it for 5 seconds and realized it was Alex Garland, I was like, oh yeah, I'm totally on board. We're, I think we like stopped watching whatever we were watching at that time so we could start Devs, and was just really delighted because I feel like Garland's work is I talk about a lot of pop culture references with my therapist, and I feel like I bring up Alex Garland more than any other, just because like I talk about like I'm very interested in religion, in cults, and in science fiction. And so that sort of trinity is very much have to do with a lot of, everything from The Beach onward. So yeah, I was very happy to put everything down and start it, and I loved it.
And we can say, like, you used to work for a tech startup, right? And your partner worked at I don't know if we can name the company, but a recognizable technology company.
Oh, we totally can. I mean, okay. He worked for Apple as a senior software engineer in their special projects group on an unnamed product. And he couldn't even, they didn't even tell him what it was during the interview. He had to, go to the interview not knowing what it's for, and do a bunch of math on a whiteboard. And, the interview was something like 6 hours long. They fed him lunch, and they went through multiple people, and, he had to basically uproot his life, not having any idea until his first day of work what the actual project was. I have no idea what the project was. People ask me all the time if he worked on, because he worked at Apple in California. Oh, did he work, in the spaceship building? And I'm like, nope. Because the special project group is sequestered from the rest of the Apple team, they obviously try really hard to keep it a secret. And there were weird things where he would come home and be like, yeah, there were like press helicopters with really, really, really zoomed out lenses, trying to get images of us as we were coming out of the building. And they had to deal with that stuff all the time. So it's crazy.
Well, I didn't actually realize his experience was so much like this TV show.
Yeah. Thankfully, nothing happened, but there were stories that he told, especially after orientation, of, people who they hired who filled up a hard drive in the middle of the night, flew to China, and, committed industrial espionage.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's definitely get back into that as we go, but I want to get Raphael in here too. So, Raphael, what were your expectations going into Devs?
Well, like everyone else, I'm a big fan of Garland, so I think they were pretty sky high. I make a point of always going into his projects knowing as little as possible, because I feel like he's one of the more interesting writer-directors of the past 20 years. Ex Machina and Annihilation, I didn't know a thing. I just went in cold, and it's such a great experience when you can actually do that. I think he's, really interesting. The one thing on him, the rap is that, he has something of a third act problem, but still it's like, his third acts are usually pretty good. They're just a little odd or not what you'd expect. With the aforementioned Sunshine, even 28 Days Later takes kind of an odd turn in the third act. Annihilation was really engaging, with the ending was kind of unsatisfactory, but also intriguing. I feel like he's always kind of right on the precipice of greatness. He's just like a consistently engaging and unlimited potential kind of filmmaker, and I consistently give him like an A-, I guess.
Well, I think it's noteworthy that this is his, transition into television after working in film, feature film for as long. I don't know if he's ever done television before.
No.
And I get the feeling that part of it was that sort of bad experiences he had in feature filmmaking. Do you know any background on this?
Well, you mentioned Dread. He wrote that, of course, but the word around Hollywood is that he also basically directed it. And it wouldn't surprise me in the least. I mean, all his projects have a very strong sensibility to it. You can really tell it's his work, whether he writes it or directs it. Like, there's always a lot of common through lines. And I do think his foray into television amplified all his strengths and weaknesses, interestingly. I'm sure we can get into that later, but it was a very, interesting project. I think it probably could have been a movie. Maybe it should have been, but I don't know.
Well, let me read some of the stuff that I came across. So this is a quote from him. He says, my filmmaking career, I've made something, I've given it to a distributor, and they say, we don't want to distribute this. And he says, I feel like I've already disappointed someone as soon as I turn in the work. And then he says, basically every film I've ever worked on, I just got sick of it. I thought maybe film isn't the right space for me. Basically, it's not mainstream, so I thought TV might be the right home. So there was something where, like, with Ex Machina, I think the original distributor didn't want to distribute it, he mentioned. And then with Annihilation, it never got distributed theatrically outside the U.S., I think, which he was really,
right, it
really
went straight
upset
to
about.
Netflix.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess, Anthony, do you know anything you can add there?
No, I mean, that's basically all I know, is that it doesn't seem like the projects don't seem high profile enough that they're the sort of legendary, tumultuous productions, but there is this sort of subtext for almost all of his films where it seems like there was at least some tension.
Yeah, this is another thing he says. I have had in the past huge battles, real screaming rows over the final cut. So yeah, I mean, that's really, too bad, because like I said, he's one of my favorite filmmakers, and his films are so intelligent and philosophical, and I really wish there was more science fiction like it. It's just it sounds like part of the reason there aren't more films like his is because of these sorts of conflicts with it's not what distributors think is going to sell, I guess, and they may be right, but
he's basically just too good for this world right now. It's all about franchises and sequels and reboots, and he's actually making original, thought-provoking science fiction. It's such a rarity, and it's great, but yeah, it's an uphill battle, I'm sure.
Yeah, and so even, stuff like Ex Machina, just how many feature films do you get that would go into thought experiments like Mary in the Black and White Room? It's pretty much just him. All right, well, anyway, it's kind of sad, but well, hopefully now that we're talking about him on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, there'll be a huge surge in popularity. But so let's go back to Sarah and have you just tell us kind of like what were your initial impressions when you started watching Devs?
Well, I was pretty much sold from the first episode on, and a lot of it is I love his sense of pace. I absolutely love it. Like, it feels like a novel, and it feels like a documentary at the same time. Like, it's not, he is very moody and evocative, and there's so much attention given to place and feel. And to me, it felt like he was filming these characters around San Francisco. And I recognized so many filming spots, even though half the film, I think, was shot on a soundstage in, like, London or something. The on-location stuff was just so, like, that is what San Francisco is like. You know the names of the homeless guys that hang out, outside of your building. You talk with them. You notice who speaks to them poorly. stuff like that. All the little touches, everybody is, second generation Chinese, second generation, Korean American, and there's just so much richness about what it was like that it was almost like triggering, but in a good way. I got nostalgic a couple of times, which is rare since I really didn't enjoy my 7 years in Silicon Valley on the whole. So, but yeah, I was sold, from the first episode on. And I think that one of the things about his work is that, I notice when I watch stuff how easily tempted I am to do other things, how easily I am to, multitask. And that, it's harder to do obviously when you're in a movie theater because you don't want to be rude. But when you're sitting in front of a small screen, it's really, obvious how much it captures your attention. And the fact that I was just glued to the TV the whole time. I was just completely under a spell.
Well, you mentioned, Sarah, the pacing, and Raphael, on Facebook, you described the pacing to me as, quote, glacial. Do you say that is that in a bad way or not?
I try not to make a judgment about that. I think I'm a fan in general of methodically slow-paced movies and shows. I do think, sometimes I have certain friends that won't be into it, so I kind of preface that saying, it's a pretty slowly paced show. But it is rewarding. I feel like it was probably stretched out a little. I mean, it's a great show, and I think contrary to his pattern, it kind of got better as it went. I thought the ending was spectacular. But it is very slow, and it's not entirely engaging in those first few episodes, at least not to me. I almost found myself checking out, but I just knew I had to keep going.
Yeah, well, I definitely thought the pacing was deliberate. I mean, I liked it, but it's definitely the sort of thing I would warn just the average person about before giving it a wholehearted recommendation. And it was making me think of, Anthony and Sarah were both on our panel about pretentious movies. And this has a lot of the things that I identified as sort of hallmarks of pretentious movies: the long shots, the kind of characters with dramatic colored lighting, the weird music, the shots of nature and stuff like that. I wouldn't call this pretentious, maybe a little bit, but it does have some of that to it. But I don't know. So Anthony, if we had brought this up, if this had been out in time for our pretentious panel, what do you think about this as a pretentious show?
I would have embraced it, and I would have pointed to it as Exhibit A in my argument that pretentious and bad are not the same thing. And that, I mean, I agree that a lot of this, there's sort of the stylistic flourishes and the pacing are, I think if you're not sort of on the same wavelength as the show, they can just seem indulgent or just dragging things out. One thing that I keep coming back to is just that opening credit sequence and how it's different in each episode, but it is clearly meant to be this sort of mix of kind of arty, but also building this feeling of dread, especially as the show goes on. And I think because I felt like it was really effective at creating this sense of dread, all of that stuff. I think there's probably a few things that didn't work, but on the whole, I was on board for it. But I could imagine that if you were a little bit more suspicious of the show, you found, you didn't find the ideas it was exploring quite as compelling, then it could get agonizing and annoying fairly quickly.
Yeah, I loved the overall vibe of it. I thought the visuals were arresting, and the haunting, foreboding sense of it was great. The atmosphere was great. But in terms of the pace, I'll quote Vulture. This is what they had to say. It struggles on that front. It moves very slowly, and its understated, extremely serious sensibility can make it feel even slower, to be almost hypnotic. And the problem with hypnosis is it tends to make you sleepy. My girlfriend could not stay awake in this show.
I would say that the first episode is pretty arresting, at least for me, because it starts by focusing on the Devs project and Sergei getting pulled in. But I agree that in subsequent episodes, when it's about Lily investigating what's happened, then the pace really slows down.
But the episodes are full though of murder, kidnapping, torture. It has fights. There's all sorts of conventionally dramatic things.
I feel like there's so much there with. The thing about whether or not it's pretentious is that it's sincere. Like, it is every line of poetry that they are reciting, and using voiceover for every shot of the greenery and the sort of contrast between nature and this very severe glass and metal building that they, have created. All of that serves the story. And I think that I've seen a lot of movies where they try to throw stuff like that in as icing on the cake to sort of make it, give it a veneer of art. And with this, every scene, every bit just feels completely intentional and completely natural. And there isn't anything pretentious about it, but there is certainly a lot that's obviously very intelligent about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just say what it's about. So basically there's a tech company in San Francisco that has developed quantum computers, and they have this secret project called Devs that nobody in the company except the people working on it knows what it is. And our main character is named Lily, and her boyfriend, and she works at the company along with her boyfriend Sergey, and he gets, I think we said, sort of pulled onto the Devs project and disappears. And then the first 3 or 4 episodes are involved with her trying to solve the mystery of what happened to him. And so Sarah, so it's, what was it like then? Like, say more about what it was like for you and your partner watching this, that you had kind of this sort of personal experience with this sort of somewhat similar situation.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a documentary to me. It felt like a really artistic documentary. And I really can't, I can't describe, unless you've actually spent time living in San Francisco, working in these industries. Like, a lot of them are very culty. A lot of them are, very much centered around the personality and the ideologies of these, tech inventors who may have created one really cool idea, and now they're being sort of treated as gods. You look at like Zuckerberg and how he's handling this thing of Facebook being used as a weapon, and he has detached himself from it completely, and he has decided that, that the system that he created is some sort of form of pure democracy. And that's not true. It's bullshit. And he has bought it so that he doesn't have to apply himself. He doesn't have to take responsibility for how this tool is being used. So, it was just, it's one of the things that made it so engrossing for us, because we've, it was extraordinary, the level of detail and the level of whoever, I'm not actually sure whether Garland himself wrote this alone or whether it was a team, but they absolutely had a grasp of what that culture is like.
Well, and let's talk about, there's this character Forrest, who's the head of this company is called Amaya, and he's definitely presented as a megalomaniacal, kind of passionate oddball sort of character. I guess, Anthony, you cover the tech industry as well, right? What did you think of this Forrest character? Did that ring true to you?
He did, yeah. I mean, there's sort of a couple different elements of Forrest, and I think this also reflects kind of the evolution of the show as a whole, that I think in its early stages seems not exclusively, but to an extent trying to create this portrait of San Francisco and of the tech world. And then I think as it goes on, it becomes more and more about, I think, this specifically exploring these ideas about determinism. And similarly, I think Forrest at the beginning in some ways feels like a way to sort of portray some of the things that are not so great about tech CEOs and founders. And one moment that I just loved and really captured something for me was the first time we see him. It's at this lunch meeting and he has 15 minutes and he's got this salad and he literally just puts his hand in and starts shoveling the arugula or whatever into his mouth, because, it's like this, it's just fuel to him, and why bother to enjoy it or spend any more time on it than necessary. And I just thought that was such a great character establishing moment. And
we both laughed out loud in that moment.
Yeah. I think I think that side of him is in some ways tied to the sort of maniacal pursuit of devs. I don't think they're like completely separate parts of his personality, but I think as the show goes on, it becomes much more about Forrest as this haunted father and husband, as opposed to Forrest just as this asshole tech CEO, although I don't think that side of him never completely disappears either.
Well, yeah, and it's, he's a billionaire, but he's kind of dressed kind of shabby and needs a haircut and, obviously is not spending his money on luxuries or, consumer things. So that's kind of interesting. But so Raphael, I don't know how much, do you ever make it up to Northern California? Like, do you have any intersection with the tech community?
My brother is actually a programmer up in Silicon Valley, so just a little. Just by association. I go up there and visit for the holidays.
So what did you think of this, like, devs campus? Their sort of weird culture and stuff like that?
I'd be lying if I didn't say I found it on some level appealing, but it's probably just because I missed college and being on campus of any kind. I've always kind of been fascinated by, any kind of corporate campus just because I work from home probably. But, yeah, it was interesting in that it was a very friendly and also foreboding place. I mean, she had friends there. There was that woman, Anya, and it certainly seemed like a cool place, but also, gosh, that statue. It makes you wonder how anyone would work there. It was really creepy, Yeah.
So let's explain. So the founder, Forrest, his young daughter had died years previously, and so the company is named after her. And there's this gigantic statue of her as a little girl that, looms over the whole complex. And the plot gets very, very complicated. And I don't know how much time I want to spend going through all of it. So maybe just like I'll just jump ahead a little bit and just suffice to say that we eventually discover that the secret devs project is using these quantum computers to gather up a bunch of data and then using that data to extrapolate backward and forward in time. So basically building a model of reality that's basically perfect, we're told, I think down to the, even maybe subatomic level. And so they know exactly what's happened in the past. They're able to, even look back at the crucifixion and see it, because the idea is that because of cause and effect, if you have a big enough data set, you can figure out what the causes must have been for everything and what the effects will be of everything. And so they're able to look into the future as well, which becomes more and more important leading into the last second half of the season. But so Sarah, what did you think of that? What did you think when you found out that was sort of the central idea of the show?
It reminded me, I mentioned that I am super interested in religion and cults and everything, and I spent 17 years in a small American town that was super, sort of this idea of, oh, this is a utopia, and of course there was a dark underbelly to that utopia, and I was raised religious, and I was raised Presbyterian, and Presbyterians, the hardcore Presbyterians, are very interested in this idea of predestination. And it is a really sick thing in a lot of ways because it is used in that religion, from what I've seen, as an excuse to treat people poorly. This idea that there are some people who are ordained by God and everyone else is not. And so, whether or not there's even any validity to that is irrelevant, because when you look at how an idea like that is handled within the human brain, it's not handled well. It means that it becomes a form of prejudice. And so the people who I knew who were hardcore Calvinists were some of the most frightening people that I knew growing up in this sort of denomination. And so I love how often science fiction will sort of explore the same concepts as religion, from the other side of it, from the opposite side of it, in a sense. And so it was super appealing to me, to explore that without all of the, both in the sense that Forrest himself was basically a religious person, right? He was just completely believed that he was correct about this determinism thing and unwilling to embrace any new information that would challenge that because of what happened, to him. And he was sort of haunted by this experience. So I was just totally fascinated by that.
Well, yeah, and just to clarify that, so he was responsible for his daughter's death and his wife's death because he was sort of like insisting that his wife talk to him on the phone while she was driving, and she ended up going through a stop sign and getting hit by another car. And so he's sort of obsessed with this idea of determinism, because if everything was always going to happen that way, it's not his fault and nothing is anyone's fault. And so
that can give people this terrifying sense that nothing has meaning, or the timeline you're in, you just got, sort of stuck in this shitty timeline. And that's a really hard thing to process. And it's a lot of what you go through when you go through trauma counseling. You talk about, why did X happen to me and not to, why didn't this happen when I was younger? Why didn't this happen when I was older, when I could handle it, or something like that? And so there's this idea that you do think about stuff when you've gone through some sort of trauma. You think about, why me? And so if there is this multiverse out there where not only is there a version of you that's happier in a different timeline, and then it becomes, well, why am I in this timeline and not in that one? And it's a very sour kind of truth. And I could see that somebody like Forrest would have a really hard time with that.
And I think the show is worth watching, I mean, for lots of reasons, but it would be worth watching just to see the scene where he's sort of walking down the street and you see all the different timelines unfolding behind him, where his wife and kid would have been fine. And it's just really, really, really visually striking and really, really powerful. But what you're saying, Sarah, about, connecting this dev system to religion is something that the show does very explicitly. Like in the trees before you get to the lab, there's like little halos around all the trees. And we eventually find out that devs is actually kind of a little joke, and that it actually spells out Deus, the Latin word for God. Anthony, do you want to jump in there? What did you think about the way that this show kind of combines science and religion?
I guess to me, the religious side of it, was certainly there. I think what engaged me more was just the exploration of this idea. And that essentially, I think Sarah was talking about it in sort of the context of like predestination. And I think they're related, determinism and predestination are sort of related ideas, but like slightly separate. And particularly to me, what was fascinating was this idea of free will and the lack of free will. And, the idea that essentially, that it made me think about how almost any other piece of fiction, because I think you could argue that for fiction to be compelling, you have to believe that characters can make choices. And part of what drives devs is the question is, can we make choices? And just to like the idea that you could go for 8 hours and just really explore that idea and take it seriously. That was part of what I just loved about the show so much. And I just couldn't think of anything else. There's certainly, again, things that have like time loops and fate, but something that just on some level, just posits that no one can make any choices. They're all just sort of acting out these predetermined programming and part of this larger system. I found like really horrifying, but also really compelling. And in fact, when you said that, it would be the show would be worth it for this one scene, for some reason, I just immediately assumed that you were going to talk about, the scene where the Alison Pill character lays out basically the concept of the show to Lily and talks about the devs project. To me, I love the scene that you're talking about with Nick Offerman, but for me, I think the standout is just, Katie, Alison Pill's character, just sitting down and being like, okay, this is why we believed in this deterministic universe, and this is how the dev system work. And that, to me, that is just like such an amazing piece of writing.
Yeah, well, that's great. But the other scene I thought you were going to mention was where they're having kind of a meeting in front of this big screen that projects the dev simulation, and they have it go 1 second into the future, and all realize that they have no choice but to enact what their avatars on the screen are doing. And that's got to be one of the scariest scenes I've ever seen. And immediately they're like, turn it off. This is freaking me out too much. And I agree. I think the show does a better job of just dramatizing the issue of free will versus determinism. than anything I've ever seen. And also explaining, multiverse versus single timeline and stuff. But Raphael, you go ahead.
Oh, sure. Those were some great scenes that you just mentioned. I actually thought someone was going to mention the scene at the dam between Katie and Lyndon. I thought that was exceptionally powerful, the way she just basically boxed him into that non-choice, Yeah. I thought the whole, determinism versus free will thing was obviously a fascinating topic. I've always actually found some comfort in the thought. I guess I'm a little like Forrest. I don't really believe in free will. So I was definitely along for that ride. I'll tell you the one thing that I'm starting to be a little wary of as a storytelling convention, though, was the entry point for the story. I feel like far too many sci-fi stories are basically centered around a murder, and that tends to be the least interesting aspect. I don't know if you've been watching Snowpiercer or if you saw Altered Carbon, but it's just a cliche I've started to notice, and I'm starting to dread it a little.
Yeah, I agree. Well, because you can see how I kind of skipped over all the thriller stuff. which is good. It's definitely to me less interesting than the high concept idea of the dev system. Let me just explain that thing about Lyndon at the dam, in case anyone didn't actually watch this. And this is toward the end of the show, but so basically, Lyndon is this genius teenager who has made significant advances on the devs technology, and gets kicked off the project for promoting the many worlds interpretation when, as we said, Forrest, who's leading the project, who's in charge, is so dead set on it not being a many worlds interpretation. And so at this scene at the dam, Lyndon is trying to get back into the project and is talking to Katie, who's the other person running the project. And Katie says, if you balance precariously at the edge of this dam, I'll let you back on the project and show to me that you really believe in the many worlds interpretation, because, because there's a chance that you'll fall and there's a chance that you won't fall. But if the many worlds interpretation is correct, there will be versions of you that don't fall, and all those versions will be able to go back on the project. And so Lyndon does this and falls and dies. And all the versions that we see fall. So I don't know if we were supposed to take away from that, if that was just kind of visually cool or what. I don't know.
That was very curious indeed. To be honest, I was anticipating that she was going to push him for some reason. It just felt like it was leading up to that, especially when you saw him falling just time after time. We never saw a version where he survived.
Well, she manipulated him and she pushed him intellectually. And, I think that scene is so haunting and so well done, in part because it shows how just totally immoral Allison's, the actress's name is Allison, Katie's character is. Like, she was a fascinating character. And you kind of, throughout the piece, you're sort of like, is she as bad as Forrest? Is she a little bit better than Forrest? And at the end, I personally came to the conclusion that she, is sort of a very detached kind of evil. And, it's not just that kid, would have decided or would have gone over that wall. It's that she was part of that conversation, and she was the one who gave him the idea to climb over that ledge, put himself in danger. And she did that knowing, so not being able to detach from your own role in things, not being able to recognize, yes, he did die in each of these, but I was still the one in each of these realities who, dared him to do it, basically, on this false premise, this thing that he wanted rather adorably. And so it's really heartbreaking.
Well, but so we're led to believe, though, that she had used the dev system to look ahead to the future and had seen this moment, and so really had no choice but to enact things exactly the way they went.
Well, we're led to question that. We're led to question whether or not she had a choice. And so, as an audience member, I'm looking at it and I'm going, well, of course she had a choice. And having seen all of that, like the one thing that I think they didn't do a good enough job covering in this show, and I think my one criticism, is that if you see yourself 1 minute in the future or whatever, like that scene we discussed, saying, holy shit, and you see yourself saying, holy shit, you're going to say something other than holy shit. It's just the natural human response to new information. And, in that split second, what you would have said is no longer what like the fact, the knowledge of events has to have some balance on the decisions that we make. And so I feel like they kind of cheated in that, where they just decided that wasn't a thing, and they decided it was a thing in her only, in Lily, and that she was special because she had that ability. But in reality, I think most of us have that option. And for her, she could have said to the kid, name is escaping me, but in the car, she could have explained to him exactly what was going to happen and truly left it, up to him and said, look, I have seen all of these options. This is exactly what goes down. Do you want to continue with this?
Well, there's kind of a big question here too, though, that we haven't delved into, about by the end. David, can we talk about how essentially the simulation and how they upload into it?
No. Let's stick with not up to So Sarah alluded to there's this part where there's a surprising thing that happens with Lily making a choice. But let's set that aside for the moment and just stick with this idea that what do we think about the way that the show portrays a deterministic universe, and do we buy it? So Anthony, what do you think about what Sarah's saying here about she just doesn't buy the idea that if you watched what's going to happen to you in 1 second, that you wouldn't be able to deviate from that?
I think that the show does answer that. I mean, I think that's maybe a little bit of a cheat. I think that's probably a fair word for it, in the sense that, they sort of stack, that they create a sort of dramatically satisfying, but maybe not intellectually robust response to that. But I would say that in general, what's happening is that the foreknowledge is incorporated into the prediction, is that like part of like knowing what's going to happen is part of what makes it happen, essentially. And I think that's essentially why, that's that scene that we're talking about where they get the 1 second ahead plays out the way it does. That's why Lily ends up going to the, Dev's facility at the end is again, because that part of what makes those things happen is the foreknowledge.
Right. It seems like a little bit. I mean, I really liked the way it portrays this deterministic universe and the sort of the horrifying consequences of that. But it does seem a little bit of a cheat. Well, it's or like a dramatic contrivance to me that, like, Lily, is told that she's going to go to this, to the dev's lab at the climax of the story, where like basically we know she's going to die. And so she has every incentive not to do it. And then events conspire to make her want to go there. But it's just hard to believe that if everyone in the world watched themselves on the dev's thing and saw themselves dying, that they would all go to that fate. Because it seems like even if the prediction is accurate, you still have to want to do the things that it's showing you doing. And, could the universe contrive circumstances to make you want to meet your end in every case? It seems a little hard to believe.
Or would the predictions just end up being very different because, most people would not behave in that way and they'd try to avoid all these, possible deaths?
I feel like the dark implication, though, is that each level further down you go, the people probably have less agency and free will. I mean, Lily was special in that universe because she had probably, the implication by the end is that she's already lived through it, maybe multiple times or infinite times. Because the events reset, but the characters that she's with at the end have even less free will than they had the first time around. But we can get into that more later.
But Raphael, you were saying that you don't believe in free will, right? So how do you respond to Sarah? Do you think that people would be able to deviate from if they're watching a 1 second in the future film about themselves?
Well, it was a clever trick of filmmaking he did there with the 1 minute thing. I think to Sarah's point, he probably realized it was a can of worms. If you do a minute or 5 minutes into the future, you're right. You should be able to essentially change the outcome just by having foreknowledge of it. But with the 1 second delay, it just wasn't enough time, and that was pretty eerie and effectively done. But I think, otherwise it just speaks to the fact that the events are locked in because they're in a system. and it's just a system within a system within a system, as Forrest alluded to. I mean, and to that end, it kind of reminded me of Duncan Jones and Source Code, if that makes sense.
Well, but I think the thing, I mean, one of the possible implications is that, you know, I mean, and this is sort of how they present it, but just that, you know, your future life is just like a movie, and you can't change what happens in your future life any more than you could change what happens in a movie. And you just have the illusion that you can, but that if it actually came to it, you would discover that, oh, actually, I thought I was in control of my actions, but I'm actually just not. And the illusion is broken by this machine.
I feel like maybe one of the things that I was trying to get at earlier is that I actually feel like part of the moral point of the show that they were actively trying to make is that one of the things you can do to be good is to rebel against the script you were given. And I think people like Allison delight in taking that script and saying, well, there's nothing I can do. This has occurred. And they take comfort in it. They take, you know, a sense of solidity from it. And it allows them to not have to worry about, you know, uncertainty and all of the things that, you know, we choose to, you know, struggle with that people, for instance, who reject religion, embrace. They embrace the mystery. They embrace the questions. They don't need to have those things answered. But people like Allison and Forrest want to embrace what they've been told is the script so that they don't have to have that pressure of deviating it from. So I feel like what they were saying is that Lily and like the homeless guy character made choices against their programming, and that in doing so, they, you know, chose the morally correct choice.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize again that the character's named Katie. I'm sure Allison is a very nice person. We do not mean to.
I completely love her as an actress, so I keep thinking of her as Allison.
Isn't it interesting that she's had a pretty big year between this and Picard? Her character always seems involved in AI.
Yeah.
I would say that I found her character here much more believable and consistent than I did in Picard.
I agree with that. She was the drummer in Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I don't know if you know that. Wow. But yeah, she's been in movies for a long time. So I guess let's get to this thing at the, you know, so Lily, I don't know how coherent this is. If you haven't seen the show, I apologize. But so basically, like Lily ends up going to Devs to take revenge for the death of a loved one, even though she knows that this is what the machine predicted she was going to do. But at this point, she doesn't care. And so Forrest sits her down and ends up, you know, showing her a film of what she's going to do in just a couple minutes, and shows that she's going to kill him and she's going to die in the process. And so then, and this is all just amazingly mesmerizing to me. But then the way it plays out is she actually is able to make a choice not to do that, which is shocking and is the first, as far as we know, violation of just causal determinism in this world at all. So Anthony, what did you think about that twist there?
It's funny because I think, you know, when you summarize it and think about it in conventional storytelling terms, it almost seems inevitable that, oh, of course, you know, somebody rejects the script and steps out of the system and is special in some way. But in the moment, it is genuinely shocking because, as far as I can tell, all the evidence of the preceding 7.5 episodes suggest that the Devs project works and everything that we've seen is what's going to happen. So in that moment, I just remember like clutching my head and like shouting at the television because I really did not expect it. I really thought that I knew that I was like, well, it's not going to be dramatically satisfying if it's literally just acting out a scene that we've already seen. But I also don't know how else they could do it. And I thought that, well, so, and I mean, then we get into the question of like, what did it actually mean that she exercised choice? And I think there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that. To me, what I found the most interesting, although I don't think this is actually what they meant, but she uses this line, "We're outside your simulation now." Or I don't forget if she uses the word simulation, but
she uses the word system.
System. We're outside your system now.
Yeah.
And to me, that was like the most part of the more compelling idea was less about whether or not determinism is an accurate model of the universe, and more, can a computer system ever fully capture the complexity of that system? And to me, it was in part a suggestion that, maybe everything is determined, but, that doesn't mean the computer can accurately represent that. Again, I don't know that that's necessarily where they were going with it, but that was more interesting than it seemed like it really then veered into this sort of like almost chosen one kind of dialogue.
Yeah.
Like, you're special, Lily. You're the one who can make a choice. And I was like, I'm not so crazy about that. I mean, the one other thing I did think was very interesting was, of course, then the contrast between Lily embracing the idea of making a choice and then the other programmer character, Stuart, who, completely abdicates responsibility for choice. And that, it's very clearly implied that he's essentially telling himself a comfortable lie.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you that I was not crazy about this twist. I mean, like, in the moment, it's amazing, but then, and my initial thought was, the Amaya, this is their hubris, and they thought their system was perfect, but actually it wasn't perfect. But then, yeah, it sort of starts to seem more like, no, Lily just has this, like, Neo from the Matrix-like ability that no one else has ever had before to have free will. And that just seemed, I really hate that kind of trope in science fiction where it's like, there's some like love or some special quality of the human spirit that enables you to defy the laws of physics and stuff like that.
But see, David, I think that was very purposeful. I think that was essentially highlighting the fact, okay, look, there's no way to talk about this without talking about the other thing. But when she resurrects and she's, hanging out with Jamie and she talks to Forrest again inside the computer, all those people are simulated. They don't have free will. Like, their lives will just unfold because they're not actually real. I think the implication is she was the only real person that we were watching the entire show because she had already come down a level from the higher level, if that makes sense.
So your interpretation is that she was in the dev simulation this whole time from the beginning of the show?
Oh yeah, I think that's entirely the implication if you watch the first episode and the last few minutes of the last episode.
Okay. What if I didn't watch the first episode again? So if I were to rewatch the first episode, what would I see that would make me think that?
Well, the way it plays out is almost the same, but there are some deliberate differences, which I found really interesting. Just the fact that Sergei's personality was a little different inside the simulation. It wasn't an exact replica. He says something different to the guy in the stoop. He's a little bit more agitated. The fact the fact that Anya, the blonde woman, doesn't have prosthetic legs inside the simulation. I think these little key details probably change each time, and they're just clues that essentially all the characters populating the simulations don't actually have free will. They must stick to the script, and I think essentially by Lily being the only one immune to that, that's the implication, is that we were watching a level of the simulation the entire show.
But I feel like they were actually just trying to say, or that all of that you just mentioned is in support of the sort of multiverse idea. It doesn't support, to me, the idea that she was in a simulation the whole time.
Yeah, I think I would have to go back and rewatch it, but I don't know. Anthony, do you have any opinions on that?
I definitely was sort of thinking about that possibility. I did not go back and rewatch the first episode, but it definitely felt like it had raised that question. I guess the other, and it sort of, the finale did also seem to touch
Actually,
on
let me ask a question. So so basically, yes. So Lily and Forrest end up dying anyway. And then they get put into the dev simulation where they're going to live happy lives. And we see a repeat of the first episode, but with changes, suggesting that Lily still remembers at some level, or maybe completely, what just happened to her. So if you go back and watch the beginning of the whole show, she's standing at that window, right? It's the same thing. Is there any indication that she remembers stuff from a previous iteration if you watch for the show from the very beginning?
You're asking?
There isn't.
Yeah, I guess not.
Because I watched the whole series twice, each episode twice, and I watched the first episode again with the benefit of having seen the finale, And yeah, I mean, there isn't any evidence that I was able to pick up on that but I think it's less of a literal thing, and it's more of they want you to question, well, if our reality can be simulated, then maybe that's more evidence that it's possible that our reality is a simulation in the first place, which is also a very popular idea in science fiction.
Because they were definitely shining a light on that with a few key quotes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Alison Pill's character said existence and the simulation are indistinguishable when she was talking to the senator at the end.
Right.
And at one point, Forrest had said something, I'm going to misquote it, but a box within a box ad infinitum, something to that effect.
So when it restarts, like she's standing looking out the window, and then Sergei says, like, what's wrong? And she says, I just had a nightmare or something like that, right? There's nothing. Do they have a conversation at all or like that?
They do.
Yeah.
He asks her if she had a bad dream or something, and she said she's not sure.
Well, but she remembers everything, and she and Forrest are the only two people in this new reality who were given those memories intact. And he even explains in a scene, that Katie's character puts, that she gave them their memories up until the last moment, and so they remember dying. Both. No.
But I'm saying at the very, very beginning of the show, the very first scene, did they have a conversation about I just had a nightmare?
No,
I don't recall, unfortunately.
Okay. Because if there's nothing, I don't know, if there's nothing at the very beginning indicating that this is somehow a redo for her, then I'm not sure how strong the evidence is that she was always in a simulation. Although the thing you said about the box inside the box ad infinitum is kind of interesting.
Yeah. I feel like it's also just kind of inherent to this sort of storytelling, like the 13th floor or something. I feel like that's why the Matrix never quite went there. There was the real world and the simulated world. Once you imply an additional simulation, then it's just turtles all the way down, right? There's no way to know.
Well, yeah, that's one of my favorite books is Philip K. Dick's The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And that's the whole idea of the book, is that once you enter a simulation that's indistinguishable from reality, how do you ever know if you've gotten out of it again?
Mm-hmm.
Inception.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just got strong source code vibes at the very end. I mean, maybe that was unintentional or coincidental, but when she reunites with Jamie, it felt like, Jake Gyllenhaal reuniting with Michelle Monaghan. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Raphael, you said you thought the ending was great, or like the best part of the show. I thought the ending was not as like the point. I thought the show was basically perfect up until the point where she throws the gun away, and then everything that happens after that is kind of like, this is fine, but it's like it feels not as good to me as the rest of the show.
Well, I suppose what I meant is that it just gains momentum. The 6th, 7th, and 8th episodes were super engrossing, Oh,
okay. Anthony, what do you think? Did you think that the end was as good as the rest of the show, or not as good as the rest of the show?
I think I'm pretty much in full agreement with you, where I don't think the end is bad, but everything that sort of comes after the gun being tossed away didn't completely work. I wasn't crazy about it. Yeah.
How about Sarah?
I had trouble believing Stuart's actions. I feel like, he was sort of the moral compass, for lack of a better term, on the team. He was kind of the one who kept quoting poetry, and they used Yeats and Philip Larkin and all sorts of poets, and he was always sort of the mouthpiece for that. And they literally talked with the kid, Lyndon, about the differences between generations, and well, you don't know anything about social justice, well, you don't know anything about Coltrane or Bach, that kind of thing. And I loved their conversations, by the way, but I feel like it just wasn't quite fitting with his character. Like, I understand why they want us to think it was fitting in with his character, but it felt like a bit of a cheat for me, just because I think in some ways he would have had to receive information just prior. Like, he would have had to learn about Lyndon's death, and immediately knew that it was related or something, for him to feel like, yes, I want to kill both of these characters. And also, unless he saw a version of this multiverse that they didn't see, and knew that she was going to throw away the gun, that's a very fast choice to make. Like, he just immediately went from A to Z with no real time in between to make that decision. And so there's, you kind of have to believe or agree to sort of gloss over those bits, because if you think about it too hard, you're like, it doesn't really mash up with the character.
No, I completely agree with that. And also his stated reason, as I remember it, is the project has to be stopped. And then the project doesn't stop. It just keeps going after that. So the whole thing seemed weird to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting little side note about the poem he was quoting from Yeats. It's actually called The Second Coming, which I just love little, Easter eggs like that or details. Garland's always really thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But real quick, to Sarah's point about the multiverse versus the simulation, which we were discussing a moment ago, I did have one question, because it seems like he was kind of having his cake and eating it too. When they upload into the simulation, we saw multiple versions. So there was even a multiverse within that. He said some would be more hell-like or hellish. I found that was really dark and interesting, and I didn't entirely know what they meant by that. But what did you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I do sort of wonder if this should have been, the thriller stuff at the beginning should have been simplified a little bit, and then a little more time spent on the simulation stuff at the end, because it did seem to kind of come in very quickly at the end and leave a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, does anyone have any more thoughts on the hellish simulations? I don't really know what to make of that.
Because, it seemed like Lily had been uploaded multiple times, and there were versions of her that were going to have a shitty life. That was pretty dark.
Right, because they do, throughout the series, kind of allude to the fact that not only is he invested in this sort of deterministic model, but I guess specifically that there's only sort of one outcome possible, which again is partly about his own guilt. And that he's very opposed to the idea of incorporating this like multiverse model into the devs project itself. And so we do know that that in some ways this multiverse model is in the system, although what exactly that means is never fully explicated. So I get the sense that there just must be a lot of different universes in devs by the end, but when that happens, how that fits in with this sort of purely deterministic script that we've seen so far, I don't know.
So another thing I want to go back to is there's this idea that, I mean, this show is clearly critical of Silicon Valley tech culture. There's a lot of lines about that. They think they're messiahs. Stewart says he doesn't like such big decisions being made about our future by people who know so little about our past. I was just wondering, like Anthony and Sarah in particular, like, do you think this is a fair critique of Silicon Valley, and do you have any idea how it's been received in Silicon
yes.
Valley?
I mean, I don't know how it's been received, but I do know that one common thread about, the sort of tech culture when I was there, particularly among the startup culture, is this idea of disrupting systems that exist. Whether it's disrupting airlines or disrupting, razor blades. So instead of going to Target and buying razor blades that were bought by Target and there's this middleman, you get them directly from the manufacturer, that kind of thing. And so there's all of these little industries that have popped up with startup culture around that concept of rejecting an existing system in place of a new one. And one of the things that I found, and I was really excited about it at first, and then I realized that so many of these tech startup people were trying to disrupt industries without actually learning what made them fail or what they were like in the first place. I mean, I originally moved out from New York to California to join a startup that was in the education sector, and the owner, the CEO, was 21 years old, and he had not had any normal jobs. He didn't work at a frozen yogurt shop at a mall yet. He didn't do all of this standard upbringing stuff. And the two people who knew the most about the school system and about what's wrong with with it and what's right were the two people who were asked to leave. And, so it was kind of this fascinating thing. And this is a pattern that I saw over and over again, where somebody would say, well, we're going to disrupt this industry. But they would actually do no research to learn what it was about that industry that was unsuccessful, what it was that made it unappealing. And I was fascinated by that hubris, And so we see that over and over and over again. And, the Stewart character in, trying to say, in one of his last scenes where he is asking Forrest, I want you to guess at least who wrote that, who said that quote that I'm repeating to you.
Yeah.
And Forrest didn't even try because he didn't acknowledge that stuff was important. So I feel like that all of that was very intentional, and I really loved it.
Well, and Stewart is quoting a poem, and he says, can you even guess who wrote this poem? And Forrest can't even guess. My impression was it was less that he's indifferent to this whole subject than that it's just he doesn't know the names of any poets and couldn't even hazard a guess. And that's sort of the point that Stewart's making, is like you can't even, I think, and then one of them says, like, is it Shakespeare? I think Katie says, is it Shakespeare? It's obviously not Shakespeare. Like, if you know anything about poetry, it's obviously not Shakespeare, right? So
no, not at all. And he was just like, oh, yeah, it must have been Shakespeare that he was quoting earlier. I love that part. That was such a meta joke.
Especially since most viewers would probably think it was Shakespeare.
Well, maybe not viewers of this particular show, but viewers in general, yes.
Yeah. But I think one of the things I really like about this show is, this whole setup is that the villainy is very thematically linked to the story, right? I mean, like every story basically involves some like evil corporation or something. But I was thinking of this like in contrast to the Pelican Brief, which is the I don't remember exactly the details, but it's something like an oil company assassinates the Supreme Court justice in order to make more money selling oil, which is like a perfectly good thriller story. But there's no necessary relation between the Supreme Court and oil or whatever. It might be something else, but it could be anything. And in this story, it has to be a tech company, and it has to be a tech company that's obsessed with collecting data. And that really resonates with people because we're all like, oh my God, these tech companies, they're just sucking up all the data. And what are they doing with the data? And they've got too much data. And that's exactly what this story expresses in a science fiction way. It's just like, it's so much data, they can see the future, the past, but it's that exact same idea that is in the real world. It's just like multiplied by 100.
Right. And I mean, I think one of the things that the show acknowledges about that I wish it had got into more, which is, I was already alluding to this earlier, is that these tech companies have all this data. And on the one hand, that's really scary on its own. But there's this other element of, sometimes I think we talk about them in this very godlike way and this very infallible way, as if like what Facebook knows about you and what Google knows about you is 100% accurate, and that they know you better than you know yourself. And I don't think that's true at all. I think a lot of what they think about you and what they assume about you is completely inaccurate. And I felt like that was nodded towards, but I would have liked to see more of that in the show.
In terms of the dev system turning out to be flawed or something.
Right, exactly. That Lily in her final action, but potentially in other ways, that the system just that maybe everything is predictable, but that doesn't mean our computer can predict it.
Do you have any sense, Anthony, of whether people in Silicon Valley are like because there was this big turn where I feel like everybody basically idolized them 10 years ago or something. And at some point there was a big turn where most, if not almost all people kind of hate them. And do you have like a sense of like how they feel about the fact that they're now the villains in shows like Devs rather than the heroes?
I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge is the fact that when we talk about people in Silicon Valley, I think mostly what we're talking about are people like the Forrests of the world, the people who actually run these companies, who found these companies, maybe the venture capitalists who write checks, funding them. I think that if you go to a company like Google, I'd be curious what Sarah thinks about this, but if you go to a company like Google or Apple or Facebook, once you start working your way down the ladder, I think that it's a lot more representative of the general population, which is to say there are some people who take these issues very seriously. There are people who take them less seriously. There are people who think these problems can be solved exclusively by technology. There are people who think, who acknowledge that there's probably, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so, I think that sometimes it can be a little bit just of a simplification to say this is what the Silicon Valley mindset is, because I don't think that's, it's not the monoliths that we necessarily want it to be. But, and I do think that to the extent that a Google or a Facebook right now is trying to get better, some of that is because, there's a self-interested component of just, there's a lot of political and, regulatory pressure to improve in certain ways. But I think a lot of that also comes from their employees, that there are people at Google and Facebook and Apple that want their companies to do better on these issues and are becoming increasingly vocal about that.
Yeah, I think it was really captured well by the senator character in one of the beginning episodes, where she says, she's trying to basically say she could basically destroy him with, the right panel on governmental oversight or something. And she says, about consumers, they use you, they need you, but they don't like you anymore. And it was, sort of perfect encapsulation of what Anthony just said of how we used to see them maybe 10 years ago versus how we see them now. And I think people are a little bit more aware that, people like Zuckerberg got lucky. He didn't have some grand vision. He was literally making the most teenage boy app that a teenage boy could make. And just, it was one of those right place at the right time.
Before, yeah.
That had been made many times before. And his version just had these unique qualities that people were ready for at that time. And now that it's grown into its own monolith, it has just as many, if not far more, problems that like MySpace had, for instance, 15 years ago. But people feel like because it's a monopoly now that they're trapped. I am only on Facebook because the majority of my friends live in different states and different countries than me. That is the only reason. If there was some other way to follow their lives as a collective, I would not be on Facebook. I would delete my account. And so there's a sense that we need these companies, but nobody likes them anymore.
I want to get Raphael back in here. Raphael, I noticed that this show was 80% on Rotten Tomatoes, which seems low to me. Did you pay any attention to the reviews or like what sort of responses the show got?
I did, yeah. Overall, especially with my friends too, I saw in general, there's a tendency to want to like anything from Alex Garland, and most people were along for the ride. But I do think the negatives that consistently came up were the aforementioned pacing and also the performances and the dialogue and the plotting, which sounds like a lot. Right. I mean, the show overall, it's got this amazing visual look and this austere vastness, and the score is really, like the chanting, it's hypnotic and it's haunting. It's really cool. But we already touched on the plotting issues. I think too much of the thriller aspect, not enough of the big ideas being fleshed out. I was reading an article in the New York Times, and they said it better than I could. Just the show's cerebral tone is matched by its performances, which are intense and detached, and they fit the stylized cool with the direction, but it doesn't give the viewer much to hold on to, especially in the focal character. I saw a lot of friends that said they just couldn't get into the show because of the lead performance, and I don't think it's an indictment of the actress. I think she was just doing exactly what Garland wanted her to do. What's interesting is she was also an Ex Machina in that amazing dance scene. So there's obviously a lot more to her, but she was told to be very deliberate and methodical. And some of those conversations, my girlfriend is an actor, and she basically was impressed at how monotonic and deliberate they were being, which is actually difficult to some extent. Like they were barely moving through a lot of that dialogue, like that excellent scene with the pen and describing what devs actually is between Katie and Lily. But I do think that made it like a harder entry point for a lot of casual viewers and even some sci-fi aficionados.
Right. It seems like that made a lot of sense for the lack of affect for Forrest and Katie, because they kind of know everything that's going to happen and they're heading toward their doom, and they feel like there's nothing they can do about it. And so this lack of emotional affect makes perfect sense to me. I agree it doesn't quite make as much sense to me with Lily, but Sarah, what do you think about that?
Well, I think this is going to sound like a snotty thing to say, but I feel like at a certain point, if a show gets an 80%, it's a higher indication of quality than if it gets 100%. Because when you have something, that doesn't appeal to everyone, that's a really good thing. And it's one of the things that makes this show not look like every other show. I mean, even, we are obviously in the middle of an explosion of creativity in terms of sort of the second golden age of television, or whatever it's being called right now. There's just so many more creative things happening in television than there are happening in film. And I think in part that comes with, the flexibility of having to tell an 8-hour story versus a 2-hour story. But so to me, it's, all of those things that he mentioned were features, not bugs.
Well, and that's a really good point too, Sarah, is that Rotten Tomatoes especially is something that's mostly harmless can register a 98%. Just all that means is that everyone liked it more than they didn't. But something that's really intelligent but divisive might only score 70 or an 80%, but it's a much better product.
Yeah.
I feel like Rotten Tomatoes aside, just my completely uninformed impression is that this show didn't get the sort of success that it deserves. And I just worry what that portends for other smart, like the willingness of people to do other intellectual, artsy science fiction shows going forward, Yeah,
I think honestly, I've noticed there's a trend, 6 episodes on a lot of Netflix and Amazon shows. It almost seems to be a sweet spot sometimes. I think this show was just a little bit too long for what it needed to be, because ultimately I think it clocked in around 6 hours over 8 hours or 8 episodes. But if it had just been 4 hours, just essentially a really long film, I think that was probably the sweet spot.
I mean, Anthony, what do you think about, did this show, how successful by external metrics do you think this show was?
I mean, it is hard to say, because all of these streaming services don't really, when they release audience numbers, it's incredibly selective. So it's hard to have any kind of apples to apples comparison. I would say anecdotally, my sense is similar to the rest of you, that it had positive but not overwhelmingly positive reviews. It hasn't necessarily stirred up a ton of conversation. It feels like sort of pretty much predestined to be a sort of a cult show. And I'm sort of torn about that in the sense that I sort of agree with Sarah in the sense that it feels like, I mean, I think there are flaws, and certainly I do agree that Lily in some ways is maybe the least interesting character in the show, or can't quite support the weight of everything that's built around her. And again, I don't think that has anything to do with the performance from Sonoya Mizuno, who I think has been amazing in a number of different things. But I also think that even the tighter version of this with a slightly more compelling central character is still not a show for everyone. And I think that's okay. And I would hope that FX knew that that's what they were getting. I don't know if that's the case, but on some level, I don't think that even if the flaws were fixed, this would be a show that everyone would love.
No, definitely not. I mean, it's a really cerebral show. And, I don't think they ever intended to do another season anyway. It's listed as a limited show, so it's probably just one and done, and that's great. I mean, I wish we would get more stuff like that. And I think, honestly, in terms of watching that first episode, it might have been tricky for some people to even get through that one, because they kind of trick you. You think Sergei is the main character at first, and turns out to be Lily, and that's definitely throwing a little bit. But, as long as you stick with it, it is rewarding. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think this was definitely always intended to be one season, because Alex Garland has said his next show, he's already sort of on to the next show, which he says, from what I gathered, is I think he said it's about civil disobedience in the present. It's not science fiction, but that it's with the same cast as Devs, that he loved working with this cast so much that he's just kind of bringing them onto his next show.
Well, I think the cult of Garland will continue to grow. I mean, anything he puts out will definitely register a certain amount of attention, and his fans are going to keep eating it up, mostly.
Yeah, and I mean, he's just such an interesting... because obviously I listen... I do a lot of interviews, and then I also listen to a lot of interviews for this podcast, and I was just listening to a new interview with Alex Garland just this morning, and it's so interesting. He's so, thoughtful, and and self-deprecating and interesting in so many ways. And I just I just wish I just get the impression that like all his projects, like there's something goes wrong, and I wish that wasn't the case because he is such a singular talent. But actually, I'll just mention this interview I watched. It was on Lex Friedman's YouTube channel, and just after you finish listening to this, go check it out because it's just a terrific interview. So I don't know. Anthony, any more thoughts on Alex Garland or directions he might go from here or anything like that?
No, I mean, just to reiterate, I love this show. I mean, I think it's despite some real shortcomings, I think it's not like anything else I've seen on television. And as much as it sounds like Garland has had some struggles and challenges in his career, and I do like to imagine an alternate universe where he is, a Christopher Nolan level success. The fact that he gets to continue to do work like this that doesn't feel compromised in any way is itself a pretty amazing achievement. So hopefully that'll continue.
Yeah, definitely this show feels like he just did it exactly the way he wanted with no, no compromises or, nothing to make it appeal to a lowest common denominator or anything like that. All right, so I think we're pretty much done. Like, Sarah, do you have any final thoughts here?
I just wanted to defend the Lily Chan character. It was surprising to me that that people had any issues with that, just because to me she felt like such a real person that I would have known, in Silicon Valley, and she reminded me of so many women that I know there that. I think also growing up, especially, in the 80s and 90s, I will never, ever tire of seeing a female character who is taken seriously, who is not, the actress herself is absolutely gorgeous. She was a ballerina, and a model, I think. And she was in a music video and, I think in the hands of somebody else, I'm so used to thinking, oh man, in the hands of somebody else, she would have been a Megan Fox character who was implausibly a computer engineer and, made up just for the sake of making her up for no reason. And she was, basically in baggy clothes, and she had short hair, and she had no makeup on that, that we could perceive as the audience. And she was just a real person to me, and I will never tire of seeing that because I was so starved of it, and women in general have been so starved in it. And I really respect Garland for, kind of making that the priority, even with something with Ex Machina, that could have easily had so many more creepy undertones of women's exploitative quality. And yet, even though it's literally a movie about, these women who ultimately are sex bots, they are given so much agency and character and realness. And it's just such a refreshing thing to see. So I really loved the character of Lily Chan.
Yeah, I agree. She seems like someone who, you might meet who works at a tech company. And so did Stewart and Lyndon, for that matter, and Forrest. Yeah. I mean, all the people, they seem like, they don't seem like the Hollywood version.
Right.
Or, I mean, maybe in some senses, but I'm like, oh yeah, I know people like that,
Yeah.
So.
I definitely thought she and Alison Pill were the highlights for me. I mean, that one scene that you mentioned earlier when they're sitting at the table and Katie is laying out what devs is. And, basically Lily is like, so you killed my boyfriend? And she's like, yes. She just owns it. And that was a really fascinating conversation. I had to watch it twice.
I guess I don't think we mentioned Jamie, the character, but I guess he's, Lily's ex-boyfriend, before Sergei. And I'll just mention, I know we didn't really talk about Kenton either, they're all like such amazing characters, but there's this scene where Kenton, who's this like ex-CIA guy, was the sense I got, is basically torturing Jamie to get him to not pursue his investigation anymore. And like it's such a horrifying scene. And after that, I was just like, okay, like if that was me in Jamie's place, I'd just be like, I'm out. I'm done. Whatever you want. I'm not investigating this anymore. Yes, sir. And just the fact that you see him like immediately, he's undeterred. I was like, holy shit, this character has some real guts here.
Yeah, I loved that he just, his response to being tortured is, okay, fuck you, still going to rescue her from the hospital. Like, that was absolutely beautiful to me. And we didn't talk about the homeless guy. We didn't talk about the whole Russian subplot. So
yeah.
Yeah. Jamie
there's just a lot to this show.
And that scene between him and Kenton was a very good scene. I mean, all of a sudden, they're just kind of hanging out. He's just sitting there talking about Tiananmen Square, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. You don't see this very often from essentially the Muscle.
Yeah, and Pete, the homeless guy who lives in front of Lily's building, turns out to be a Russian agent and stuff. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff we didn't really get to. But I mean, if you haven't seen the show, you can. Actually, I shouldn't have spoiled that, I guess, if you haven't seen the show. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot to this show, and yeah, there's a lot to like. I mean, like I said, the ending, I think maybe could have been done a little bit differently, but it's just such a good show overall, and I really want people to support smart science fiction like this because I always want more of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, and so let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Raphael Jordan. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, David.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Raphael Jordan for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.